question. What makes anthropology a distinctive social science? That's really the question I want to address today. I've titled the lecture The Anthropological Approach. I like this funny comic. It's a rather straightforward lecture. I want to answer this question by highlighting for you really the 8 most distinctive attributes of our discipline. These are the things that make our discipline, in my mind especially, unique. So let me begin with what is really probably the most significant distinguishing feature of our discipline. And that's, of course, something we've just been talking about. It's our methodology. And I would just put that together, our primary method as well, right? And again, with methodology, I'm again referring to how anthropologists come to know what they know or what we think we know about a particular society. So I'm pointing toward the ways that we as a discipline produce our knowledge. How do anthropologists come to understand that which we are trying to understand? And why is that approach unique from other social scientists who are also trying to understand aspects of the human condition? And sociocultural anthropology's overarching sort of methodological assertion, again, we've been talking about it, is that the best way to come and understand another culture or another society is to go there, is to live in that society, to live surrounded by that culture for an extended period of time, for 1 to 2 years ideally, to live alongside people who are living in that society, and to live there in the very same sort of ways that those people who are native to it live there. So in other words, the best way to learn another culture is to, like I often say, learn it like a newborn child learns its own culture. Like you all, like we all learned our own native cultures. No one taught you your native culture. You simply learned it by being there, by being raised in it, by emulating the people around you, by asking lots of questions. I don't think it's a coincidence that we ask most of our questions when we're kids. When you have kids one day, you will feel like your kids are constantly asking you questions, and you probably remember yourself, your parents telling you to stop asking so many questions at various points of time. Somehow along the way, we stop asking questions. It's a process of learning our own culture, really. So, given that as our primary methodology, it means or implies that it's also a very open and sort of iterative methodology. Other disciplines ask very specific questions. They often, for example, maybe develop a hypothesis in which they go out and try to test it, to prove it or disprove it. But us anthropologists, we ask not questions in particular, but we like to go out and research problems. We go out and research issues. Our research process is not that clearly laid out when we begin it. It's not that clearly structured. It's not so clearly pre-planned, like, for example, a scientist working in a laboratory would have to do. We iterate over time because it takes us time to learn about the problem we're actually trying to explore in the first place. And often we're doing this learning really in context, in ways that lead us to actually change or amend our research priorities and approaches along the way. Sometimes we even have to amend our research question midway through. And that sort of openness, that sort of iterativeness could never happen, for example, in a chemistry lab. You can't just change your protocol in the middle of a chemistry experiment. So when I sort of undertook a couple of years of research in Namibia, I've told you I went off to study politics, but soon enough, of course, after having been there for a while, I came to realize that I needed to study kinship as well. It wasn't until I got there and started talking to people and started learning that I actually was not studying politics in such a narrow way as I had thought when I set out. I realized that, for example, kinship was very central to the political imagination of the people that I was living with. And so the overriding methodology that underpins our discipline requires this intensive immersion, right, in the community of study through this long period of field work, which, like I said, usually lasts between 1 and 2 years, ideally. And by living in the respective community of study, an anthropologist is able to gain qualitatively unique insights, qualitative insights and understandings into the society and culture. That is essentially our methodology. The main method that this overriding approach adopts, the main method to this methodology is what we call participant observation, right? And participant observation is a very particular way of generating knowledge because it involves sort of a complex process whereby the anthropologist is simultaneously participating in the community, in the foreign community, and at the same time is observing it all the way through, right? And with respect to participation, that means that, again, we live with people in that society. We sleep in the same houses, we eat the same foods, we do the same kind of work, we try to learn and speak the same local languages. We take part in daily life, whatever it may be, from helping with the harvest to going to church to funerals to whatever it may be. And all the while we are observing and analyzing all the way through. And that means we're taking constantly extensive notes, we're interviewing and talking to people, and like a small child, we are asking countless questions to the people all around us. And in that way, we're collecting data in an effort to document the society of study. So long-term fieldwork, and especially participant observation, is quite a unique and a special way of generating social scientific knowledge. The political scientist, the sociologist, the economist, for example, would rarely consider adopting such an approach in their research. And instead, they would prefer to generate their knowledge through other means, through surveys, through interviews, through the collection of quantitative data, through statistical analysis. Other such methods would be used. So, as a unique method, participant observation generates a unique set of data, a unique set of perspectives, insights, understandings. And I should say that this doesn't mean that participant observation is necessarily the best or the purest method, or by any means should be the only method. I would never say that. I would simply say it's unique. And I should also say that participant observation has many, many challenges, and it can be very, very problematic at the same time. It's not perfect, and we will continue to explore some of those challenges throughout the remainder of the term. Okay, a second distinguishing factor of our discipline is most certainly cultural relativism. Right? We've talked about that as well. You'll recall that cultural relativism is an approach that asserts that the behavior in, say, one culture should not be judged by the standards of another culture. That all cultures require equal respect and should be measured only against themselves. Right? In other words, beliefs, customs, and morality, they exist in relation to a particular culture and to a particular context. They're not absolute, and they thus cannot be compared in order to ascribe greater or lesser value to one or the other. It asserts that there are no universal standards by which to measure or assess culture. And one of the unique things about anthropology is that cultural relativism lies at the heart of everything we do and everything we try to understand. And that simply isn't the case with maybe any other social science. Every other social science, I think, tries to understand whatever it is trying to understand in its own terms, based on that respective discipline's view on the world. And anthropology is different. Branislav Malinowski, he's credited for having given us our raison d'etre when he wrote in 1922, and I quote Malinowski, "The final goal of which an ethnographer should never lose sight. The goal is briefly to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. Perhaps through realizing human nature in a shape very distant and foreign to us, we shall shed some light on our own." Thus, our goal is to try to understand other people's understandings of their own world from their cultural perspective, not from our own cultural perspectives. That is a very unique attribute of socio-cultural anthropology. Next, and this takes us back in time a little bit, but when socio-cultural anthropology was established as an academic discipline, right? And this was again in the late 19th century. Anthropologists distinguished themselves from other social scientists at those times by the fact that they studied non-Western peoples, right? They were studying those cultures and those societies that at that point of time were often referred to as primitive or simple societies. And during these early years, a sort of academic division of labor existed, whereby anthropologists specialized in the study of humans who were living in those far away and at that time, difficult to reach places. And the study of sort of culture and society much closer to home in North America and Europe, where our field was actually taking root and was beginning. Those sorts of questions were left to really the sociologists and the political scientists and the economists. And in the present day, this academic division of labor has fallen away in some significant ways, right? European and North American sociocultural anthropologists are now doing a lot of research in their own countries and, of course, in industrialized settings around the world, while our academic counterparts in sociology and in political science and sometimes even economy are researching in sort of non-Western settings. And I guess the important point for what I'm trying to say is that, sociocultural anthropology is distinguished by the fact that it has this long history. It's this long history of studying people in non-Western settings that is unique to our discipline. It's a legacy, and as a result of this legacy, anthropology has developed a lot of specialized knowledge in certain parts of the world. And this legacy also means that today most anthropologists, not all, but the majority, continue to work in the so-called global South and also in foreign settings. Okay, the fourth feature that I want to highlight, again, that distinguishes our discipline, anthropology, from the other social science disciplines, is that it adopts a holistic approach to the study of culture and society. You've heard that term. In other words, anthropologists observe and study society and culture in its entirety. Every aspect of a respective society or culture is considered in relation to all other aspects of it. Right? So, for example, you might call me a political anthropologist. It's important for me to understand the relationship between politics and other elements of life in Northwest Namibia, where I work, and to blur the lines between what, say, a political scientist might define as politics and other aspects of life. My research on politics and the state in Southern Africa inevitably led me to topics like kinship, economics, history. It took me out of my lane, so to speak. And had a political scientist undertaken such a study, more likely than not, he or she would have probably imposed much stricter boundaries on the research problem at hand. And so as a result of this holism, this refusal really to stay in any particular social scientific lane, anthropologists are sort of, we say, we're sort of maximalist in our approach. What does that mean, to be maximalist? It means that our understanding of what constitutes politics or religion or economics is much, much broader than the other social science disciplines that specialize in those respective fields. So to go back in time a little bit, in the mid-20th century, for example, political scientists and others studying politics were asserting that peoples, such as the many pastoralist and hunter-gatherer societies that lack centralized leadership, that lack government, laws, courts, even leaders sometimes, that they didn't have a political system. Our political scientists could not find a so-called political system among hunter-gatherers or pastoralists. Now, anthropologists working in those societies in sub-Saharan Africa pushed back. Again, we're talking the middle of the last century. They asserted that indeed, even these acephalous societies, these societies that lacked formal leaders, that even acephalous societies had political systems, but that political scientists were simply too narrow in their search for it, and thus were missing it. So these anthropologists showed that kinship systems, for example, and age grade systems constituted a political system for those societies. Or take our colleagues in the economics department. They focus primarily on capitalist economies today, economies that make use of general purpose money in the exchange of, say, goods and services, right? And they rarely bother to research or to teach or to even think much about societies and people who engage in economics without markets, right? Think of the millions, the few billions of people that live today as subsistence farmers, that are engaged in non-market exchange systems that involve, say, barter. Think of hunter-gatherers. Maybe many economists might go so far to claim that these societies don't even have an economy. Anthropologists have always taken a much broader approach. When we study economy, we focus on the three main economic practices: production, consumption, and distribution. Subsistence farmers, fishermen, hunters and gatherers, pastoralists, they all produce, they all distribute, and they all consume. Indeed, they have an economy. Or take our colleagues in the field of religious studies and theology. When they study religion, they usually study Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, right? The so-called world religions. Anthropologists don't even like to use the word religion because we find that word too narrow, right? We speak of cosmology. We speak of cosmology to denote the myriad of ways that humans maintain spiritual beliefs and assumptions and conceptualizations regarding the world and their place in it. When we study religion, we do study the world religions, but we also study all sorts of other things like ancestor worship, like shamanism, like witchcraft, like spirit possession. There's just a few examples. So back to the main point. The holistic approach, our holistic approach, leads us to take maximalist perspectives on the main fields of human praxis. And this differs, I think, significantly from our social science colleagues working in other disciplines. In fact, I'd say that our holism and this maximalism that comes along with it is what makes anthropology really the most interdisciplinary of the social sciences. And that's why we here in this course, in our field, are often reading in, engaging with other social sciences, as we do in this course. And it's also, I think, why I would argue that anthropology is the best exemplar of a liberal arts and sciences education as well. Because liberal arts is essentially an attempt to take a much more maximalist, holistic view on knowledge more generally. Something that is already baked into our field of anthropology. What this education is about, what this education is supposed to be about, is a refusal to stay in our lane, a refusal to ask big questions and only answer them through very narrow avenues. Anthropology, like liberal arts, is holistic and maximalist. Okay, the fifth characteristic that sets socio-cultural anthropology apart from other social sciences is an emphasis on what the American cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz termed thick description. You might have come across it before. Let me quote Geertz. He writes, "Anthropology is thick description. What the ethnographer is in fact faced with, except when he is pursuing the more automatized routines of data collection, is a multiplicity of complex conceptual structures, many of them superimposed upon or knotted into one another, which are at once strange, irregular, and inexplicit, and which he must contrive somehow first to grasp and then to render." So the anthropologist's aim is therefore to observe and to record and to analyze and to interpret in such great depth and detail that meaning within culture can be grasped and conveyed. Right? And it's through this thick description that all possible meanings of a sign can be interpreted. And in trying to explain the notion for his readers, Geertz offers this example, this sort of famous example of a wink of an eye, a winking eye. And without a proper context, he explains, a person's wink is rendered meaningless, right? If I'm winking at you, does that wink mean that I have a problem with my eye, like something has flown into my eye, or maybe my contact lens has moved? Does it mean that maybe I sort of fancy you and I'm trying to flirt with you? Is the wink trying to communicate some form of complicity in a secret? Like, watch this. Is the action an attempt to convey some sort of understanding? And so forth. And it's through this deployment of thick description where the anthropologist does much more than simply just describe the action. An eyelid opens and closes. But here, the anthropologist has to dig much deeper in order to analyze and interpret and convey the meaning and also the changing meaning in that very simple act. So this is really about anthropology's obsession with and concern for the finer textures and the subtleties of everyday social and cultural life. And as one therefore should, in might expect, thick description can often generate really rather microscopic descriptions. Anthropologists specialize in presenting descriptions and analysis and interpretations of really like the micro processes of everyday social and cultural life. Whereas the economist chooses to understand the workings of a national economy through, say, unemployment rates or exports and imports or foreign exchange controls and interest rates, the anthropology teaches the anthropologist to choose to focus on how social relations are built and maintained by, for example, the pooling of household labor, or how the gift exchange projects social relations into the future, and so forth. So anthropologists are offering just a different level of analysis. And so to summarize the point then, anthropology sets itself off from other social sciences through its insistence that this minutiae of everyday life, the everyday things we do, it's pregnant with meaning. And that it's the anthropologist's role, our job, to get at this richness through this thick description, through this fine-toothed analysis, through interpretation. So this is about qualitative analysis. This is not quantitative. This is about narration, description. It's not about numbers and percentages. It's about texture, substance, emotion, feeling. Sociocultural anthropology is intensively and intensely qualitative in nature. Really so much, in fact, that it's probably correct to say that it's the most humanistic of the social sciences. It's the closest social sciences to the humanities that exists. Of all the social science disciplines, anthropology is right there, nudging up against the humanities themselves. And given the extent to which anthropology is so qualitative in nature, it is not surprising that as a discipline, it required a special form of communication. And that, I think, is the next unique attribute of our discipline. The early founders of sociocultural anthropology, who set out to create this new field of knowledge about our species, people like Malinowski and Franz Boas in particular, they spent a couple of years living with and like the people they were trying to understand and gathering vast amounts of data, of qualitative data. And when they returned home, they had to first interpret the knowledge that they had acquired, and then they had the problem of trying to figure out how to communicate that to the rest of us, how to share that knowledge with others who hadn't gone there, who hadn't lived with other people, who didn't have that knowledge. And ethnography is the form that communication took. Ethnography should be thought about as a unique form of writing, just like autobiography or biography or historiography. Ethnography literally means writing about or describing an ethnic group or a culture. And ethnography then is a sort of a book, as it was originally conceived, a book that contains anthropological description and interpretation and analysis and comparison. And of course, I've mentioned many times before that today, ethnography also often takes the form of film. So anthropologists write ethnographies. We produce ethnographic films that describe the social life and culture of a particular group of people. And this is the main way that our discipline preserves and conveys its knowledge, the knowledge that it generates. And we often sometimes refer to the entire collection of ethnographies ever written as the so-called ethnographic record. The ethnographic record preserves our discipline's knowledge over time. This is how we preserve our knowledge. This is how we build on our knowledge, through the ethnographic record, through the history of all ethnographies ever written. So anthropology is a unique social science because it has this unique form of communication. And ethnography is anthropology's genre of writing. And not only is anthropology's mode of communication unique, but so also is its mode of analysis. To say it very simply, and I've said it quite often during the past month, anthropology asks big questions in small places. That's our mode of analysis. And what this precisely means is that when an anthropologist begins a research project, he or she will almost always begin with a rather big and general question or problem that is worthy of exploration. Take one of the most famous and earliest American anthropologists, Margaret Mead, someone you're a little bit familiar with now. In the 1920s, almost everyone in the United States where she was from believed that the reason people in other parts of the world lived so differently from Americans at that time was because they were of a different race, right? And this reasoning applied most significantly at that time to those people who were still being labeled primitives. So she, Margaret Mead, and her professor, Franz Boas, were one of the few at that time in that place who believed otherwise. It's not race, it's not nature that makes people in faraway places live and think and act so differently from Americans, but rather culture, rather nurture. That's what they believed. That was their argument. So when Margaret Mead set sail as a young 20-something anthropologist under the tutelage of Franz Boas, she set sail for Samoa, and she had that big question in mind. Is it nature or nurture that shapes people? Is it race or is it culture that shapes people's experiences? And she set out to explore that big question in the very small place of Samoa by studying female adolescents there. In the US, you will know it was common thinking that, and still it is today, that adolescence is such a turbulent period of life for young girls in particular because their bodies are changing so quickly and drastically during that period of the life cycle. The physical body of an adolescent is moving very quickly. And so, at that time, and still today, many people attribute biology, nature, to explain the root of adolescent turbulence. And Mead wanted to determine whether adolescent girls in Samoa also struggled like their American counterparts. If the answer was yes, then the nature and biology side of the argument would be supported. If the answer was no, then it must mean that culture and nurture had a role to play, right? And of course, you know now she discovered that Samoan girls had a very different experience of their teenage years compared to American teenage girls of the time. In fact, Mead points out it was a rather calm, carefree period of life for them. The point being that anthropologists operate by asking rather big questions, often quite theoretical in nature, by traveling to small communities in order to investigate those questions very deeply. And with the answers they find in those small places, they then return to their big questions, they return to their theory in order to try and reflect on a much broader social and or cultural problem. And it is just this sort of approach that guides anthropologists in their attempts to build better theories and understandings about human society and human culture more generally. And I guess the last main feature that I want to point out that distinguishes socio-cultural anthropology as a discipline relates to our discipline's comparative mandate. Anthropology has always maintained interests that are much more ambitious than simply understanding the specificities of any particular society or culture. The thick description that anthropologists produce has always been applied to a wider comparative project within the discipline. The field of anthropology aims to examine societies in relation to other societies, to find similarities and differences, to account for them. All anthropologists undertake comparison in their work. We compare our findings with those of other anthropologists working on similar topics in other parts of the world, in other periods of time. Through my research, for example, in Northwest Namibia, if you read some of my work, you'll find that I'm reflecting on differences and similarities in other parts of Namibia, in other parts of Africa. Sometimes I even work with ethnography from entirely different continents. The purpose of all this anthropological comparison is really twofold. First, we compare our field findings with those of others in order to help us with our own analyses and interpretations relating to our own field data. In other words, we compare to better understand our own data and the ethnographic specificities of our individual research sites. It helps us. And secondly, anthropological comparison allows anthropologists to reflect really on the human condition more generally, on what it means to be human, what it means to live together as humans. And through ethnographic comparison, we come to better understand really the social and cultural dynamics of our own species. So comparison has always been central to the anthropological undertaking. And I want to quickly turn, after having sort of outlined for you these, 7 or 8 distinctive attributes of our discipline, I want to quickly turn towards some of the other social science disciplines in order to really specify how the main differences between anthropology and some of the other social science disciplines plays out. And it's going to be slightly simplified, maybe overly simplified, but it's just a little bit of a experiment or a way of trying to illustrate some of this distinctiveness a little bit more in direct relation. So like, for example, anthropology versus sociology. Sociology and anthropology are often the two social sciences that are most often confused. It often generates the greatest degree of confusion between people. Traditionally, previously, sociologists researched primarily in so-called complex Western industrialized societies, right? And as I mentioned earlier, anthropologists specialized in so-called non-Western, simpler societies, often what were termed non-literate societies. And this distinction between sociology and anthropology, between the disciplines, has begun to collapse, right? Lots of anthropologists are now studying at home in Western societies. There are sociologists going off to faraway places as well. So that distinction is changing. And then there's that different methodological approach between sociology and anthropology. Sociologists tend, not all of them, a lot of them, to be quantitatively focused, while anthropologists are much more qualitatively oriented, right? So you'll find sociologists much more willing and able and trained to undertake surveys and censuses and questionnaires and then run all that through SPSS and generate statistical analysis. Anthropologists focus on participant observation. We do interviewing, we do a lot of conversation, we do a lot of description. We hardly do very much statistical analysis at all. If we look at, for example, anthropology versus political science, socio-cultural anthropologists, of course, also study politics, right? So what are the main differences between the way us anthropologists and our colleagues in the political science department do it? Well, political scientists, I tend to say, focus on what we think of as high politics, right? The stuff we read about in the newspapers all the time. Elections, diplomacy, heads of states. Anthropologists, I sort of explain, often attend to low politics, the everyday politics of living. It may be a view on national politics, but what it looks like from the local community, from ordinary people. It may be about relations between neighboring communities. So there is a sort of high politics, low politics distinction there. I would also say that political scientists are much more quantitative than anthropologists. Again, political scientists are very well equipped to undertake statistical analysis to collect large amounts of numerative data. And as I touched upon before also, anthropologists are maximalists when it comes to defining the political. Us, anthropologists, think of the political as a much broader field of living practice than political scientists do. And lastly, political science tends to be quite a normative field of study, while anthropology retains its cultural relativism. And then there's economics. Anthropologists study, as I've mentioned, the economy as well. What's the main difference? Again, economists take a much narrower view on what constitutes economic practice, and therefore on the types of economic activity that they focus upon. Economists basically study economy primarily, most of them, in the context of market systems. That is, the societies that are characterized by the economy-wide operation of general purpose money, and prices are governed by so-called laws of supply and demand. And this means that economists have inevitably focused most of their attention on sort of industrialized and post-industrialized economies. And anthropologists study this kind of stuff too. We do study industrial and market economies. But in addition to that, we also focus on 4 other types of economic systems that most economists simply ignore. And these other types of economic systems encapsulate billions of people on the planet. I'm talking about foraging economies, hunters and gatherers, horticultural economies, what we call shifting agriculturalists, agricultural economies, subsistence farmers, and pastoral economies, right? People who are living off the raising of livestock. Economists generally do not include these other 4 types of economic practices in their renderings. And I might also add that economists tend to generally believe that the theories and methods and approaches developed in the Western free market capitalist world serve as a foundation. Well, these ideas serve as the foundation for their field of economics to begin with, but what they also argue is that these foundational ideas, these assumptions, have application everywhere in the world and for all people. And anthropologists, on the other hand, tend to believe that the economic models and theories developed by economists are sort of hopelessly embedded in a particular epistemology, right? One that has little application in other parts of the world, certainly not in all parts of the world. We call economists formalists, and anthropologists we call substantivists. And finally, economists are, of course, as you'll know from reading the newspaper, very quantitative. Anthropologists, again, we are very qualitative, very descriptive. And then there's one other comparison I want to make between anthropology and psychology. Socio-cultural anthropologists also study psychological phenomena. There's a whole, psychological anthropology subdiscipline. What's the main difference between the psychologist and the anthropologist? Psychology is really focused on understanding the individual, while anthropology is focused on the collectivity. Right? So psychology is looking at the human being as an individual, and anthropology is looking at human beings in relation to one another. Most psychologists, certainly not all, but many, are diagnostic and therapeutic in their approach, right? So a large chunk of psychologists, probably the largest chunk of trained psychologists in the world, are trying to affect a certain type of change in individuals, right? These are the people we go to for therapy. Anthropologists are generally interested in describing and understanding rather than treating people or their culture. And thirdly, the field of psychology is also quite a normative social science. It's one that's based on conceptions of personhood and selfhood that is historically, culturally, and geographically situated, mostly in Europe. Anthropologists with a psychological orientation are sort of cross-culturally comparative and culturally relative, as you would expect, in their approach. They consider, for example, I always like this example, like how and why certain manifestations get labeled schizophrenia in, say, the Western world, while in other places they might be labeled shamanistic. And anthropologists, of course, don't believe that the field of psychology, as we all mostly know it on this part of the world, has relevance to everyone everywhere. People around the world have totally different understandings of the self. They have different understandings of what it means to be a person. Some peoples, a lot of peoples in the world, don't even have a conception of the individual or the ego that is so central in the field of psychology. Okay, let me take the last couple minutes to end really with some relatively recent trends in our field of socio-cultural anthropology, particularly in relation to these disciplinary boundaries that I'm talking about. And the first trend I want to just flag up for you is toward greater interdisciplinary overlap. So, anthropologists are borrowing methods and approaches from other disciplines, a lot more than they used to. So sociocultural anthropologists have become very historically focused in the last 30 years, and they have been much more attentive to the place of time and temporality in their analyses. So we're often working in the archives now. We work with oral history. And furthermore, anthropologists have also recently begun to use more quantitative approaches. For example, surveys and questionnaires are much more prevalent in anthropological work than they used to be. And these days, big data is also working itself, and data science, into the field of anthropology. So on the one hand, we're seeing anthropologists borrowing methods and adapting methods from other disciplines. And secondly, we're also seeing a lot more overlapping objects of study. So again, anthropologists are no longer working solely in non-Western, so-called simple societies, right? Both sociologists and anthropologists are studying crack dealing in New York City, for example. Anthropologists have also begun turning their attention away from localized and very small objects of studies, like the village, in favor of much larger ones that were traditionally reserved for other disciplines, for example, like the state. And also, anthropologists now often write even purely historical accounts, something that was previously reserved really for the historians. So on the one hand, we see this greater interdisciplinary overlap, but we're also seeing greater intradisciplinary specialization and fragmentation within our field of anthropology. In the early days, one was simply either a social or cultural anthropologist. We've talked about that, and that sort of depended on whether one was trained in North America or in Europe, particularly the UK. And by the middle of the 20th century, we began finding anthropologists of religion, and anthropologists of kinship, and political anthropologists, and economic anthropologists. They started becoming a little bit more specialized. And today, there are in fact so many subdisciplines that one cannot even keep them all in mind. It's very difficult to put them into a survey course. There's urban anthropology, there's medical anthropology, there's the anthropology of development, there's corporate anthropology, there's all sorts of applied anthropology, there's educational anthropology, there's psychological anthropology, legal anthropology, and on and on and on it goes. So there's been a much greater tendency towards specialization and fragmentation within our field over the past, again, I would say 30 to 50 years. Okay, let me conclude. And I want to conclude simply by saying that socio-cultural anthropology is a rich field of study that is indeed quite different from the other social sciences, despite our often shared subject matter. Again, is anthropology the best or most correct when it comes to its findings? I wouldn't dare to say that. But I would say that our field is unique among the social sciences. It shines a different sort of light on us humans. It enlightens certain aspects of human group living that often go unnoticed or simply maybe ignored in the perspectives of other disciplines. Or, as we often tend to say, anthropology is really good at helping us see that the social and cultural lives we live are actually much, much more complex than most of us would choose or like to believe. That's where I would like to leave it today. Thanks.